The stories. Never ignore calls from a ranger station. The warning was printed on the county dispatch poster after the incident at the North Ridge Ranger Station. It was not a slogan, it was a reminder, written like a bruise. In late September of 2019, Tamsin Crow was 34 and worked as a county radio technician. She drove service routes between towers, repeaters, and the kind of buildings people forgot existed. That morning, she had one simple goal: swap a failing battery bank before the weekend storm arrived. The request looked routine: a maintenance ticket with a ranger station phone number attached. The station sat near a long stretch of forest road in a western state that gets windy in fall. It was not remote like a postcard, but it was far enough that help came slowly. Tamsin packed tools, a spare handset, and a digital recorder she used for interference complaints. She also brought a printed map, because cell service vanished on the last ridge. About 20 minutes from the station, her work phone rang with a number she did not recognize. The caller ID still labeled it as the Ranger Station, which made her lift it quickly. A man spoke in a flat tone, and his words sounded like they were being read. "Do not come here alone. Do not call the sheriff. Bring the radio keys." Tamsin asked who he was, and the line went silent except for a soft clicking sound. It was not wind. It was rhythmic, like a relay switching on and off somewhere nearby. She said she could call the ranger on duty, and the man whispered one more sentence: "Tell dispatch the blue folder is not theirs." Then hang up. The call ended, and her phone showed full bars for a moment before dropping to none. Tamsin pulled over, took a breath, and wrote down the exact wording in her notebook. She tried to call back, but the phone acted like the number did not exist. That was the first time she considered turning around, and she did not yet. She reached the ranger station a little after 10, and the parking lot was empty. The building looked normal: a low office with a covered porch and a faded mapboard. A sign on the door said, "Closed for training." But the chain was not latched. Tamsin knocked anyway, then waited long enough to hear her own tires ticking. When nobody answered, she walked around to the side where the utility cabinet sat. The cabinet held a backup radio console and a line to the nearest repeater tower. The padlock had been cut cleanly, and the broken shackle lay in the gravel. Tamsin did not touch it, and she backed away as if it might still be hot. She returned to her truck and called county dispatch on the two-way, not the phone. Dispatch answered quickly, and Tamsin kept her voice steady while giving her unit number. She said she had arrived for maintenance, and she had received a strange warning call. She repeated the line about the blue folder, and the dispatcher paused before replying. The dispatcher asked her to say it again, and Tamsin did. Slower this time. A second voice came on, reportedly a supervisor who handled after-hours ranger contacts. He asked if the caller mentioned radio keys, and she confirmed that detail quietly. Then he told her to stay in her vehicle and not to enter the building. Tamsin watched the front door, and she saw a dim shape pass behind the glass. It was not a clear silhouette, more like a shadow crossing a hallway light. She keyed the mic and told dispatch what she saw, and her hands shook once. Dispatch said units were en route, and the supervisor told her to keep recording. Tamsin turned on her digital recorder and set it on the dashboard near the speaker. She kept the truck idling, and she angled the mirror to watch the porch. A minute later, the station phone rang again, and this time the sound carried outside. It rang from inside the building, muffled and lonely, then stopped, then rang again. Tamsin did not answer her work phone when it lit up, even though instinct begged her. Instead, she recorded the ringtone pattern because it sounded slightly warped, like tape drag. Dispatch asked if she could read the number on the caller ID, and she tried. It displayed the ranger station number again, as if the station were calling itself. A deputy arrived first, then a second unit, and they parked behind her truck. They kept their lights off, and they approached on foot with hands near their belts. Tamsin stepped out only when told, and she handed her recorder to the deputy sergeant. She explained the cut lock, the shadow, and the message about the blue folder. The deputies checked the front door and called out, but nobody answered from inside. They entered with caution, and Tamsin stayed outside near the trucks with dispatch on radio. Through the open door, she could hear boots on tile and a distant phone ringing again. A deputy called for a ranger by name, then asked for a key holder, then swore softly. The sergeant came back out and told Tamsin to wait, but his face had changed. He said the building looked staged, and he did not mean messy. or ransacked. He meant chairs were placed wrong, files were open on a desk, and radios were unplugged. He also said the station logbook had been removed, along with a blue folder. The mention of the blue folder made Tamsin feel cold, even in the sun. She asked what the folder was, and the sergeant did not answer right away. He said it might be nothing, then added that it was nothing he wanted to guess. Then he asked if she could help them understand the phone and radio setup. Tamsin walked them to the side cabinet and pointed out the cut padlock. She explained what the cabinet powered and how the backup console could patch calls. The sergeant asked if a person inside could spoof the station number on outgoing calls. Tamsin said it was possible, but it would require access to the line interface. She opened her notebook and showed the message, written exactly as she heard it. The sergeant read it twice, then asked why someone would say not to call the sheriff. Tamsin said the voice sounded trained, like a script, not like panic or a prank. Dispatch came over the radio and said they had pulled archived calls from the station. According to dispatch logs, the station phone had called 911 twice that morning. Both calls were open line, with faint clicking noises and no spoken words. The calls came from the station number, and the location pinged correctly on their system. It meant someone used the station line, or someone made it look that way. A ranger supervisor arrived next, a woman named Marlo Penn, 41, district manager. She greeted the deputies with tight shoulders, then asked Tamsin to repeat everything. Tamsin did, and Marlo listened like she had heard pieces of it before. Marlo asked for the recorder back, and she promised it would be logged as evidence. Marlo also said 2 rangers were supposed to be on duty for training, but nobody checked in. She did not give names, and she kept details vague, like she was protecting staff. The deputies asked if there were any internal investigations, and she said, not officially. Then she said there were rumors, and rumors were why she drove out so fast. Inside the building, the deputies found a desk phone off the hook on the floor. They found the backup radio console open and a jumper wire tied into the patch port. Tamsin recognized the setup because it could route a radio transmission into the phone line. It could also route a phone audio feed into the radio if someone knew the settings. That detail changed the whole feeling of the day because it meant the warning call mattered. It also meant the clicking sound might be a relay toggling the patch on and off. Tamsin told Marlo that, and Marlo looked at the cabinet like it was a trap. Marlo asked if someone could broadcast using the station number as cover, and Tamsin nodded. By early afternoon, the search widened to the nearby trails and the storage shed behind the station. A K-9 team arrived and worked the porch, the hallway, and the back lot. Witness statements later said the dog alerted near a locked closet in the rear office. The closet was open when they forced it, and it held only a mop bucket and a clean shelf. But the wall behind the shelf sounded hollow, and a deputy noticed new screws in the trim. They removed the trim and found a narrow access panel hidden like a cheap stage trick. Behind it was a crawl space with a metal file box pushed deep into the dark. The box held cassette tapes, dispatch printouts, and a single blue folder with no label. Tamsin stood outside while they brought it out, and she watched faces tighten again. The tapes were old, and several were marked with months from 2016. A deputy said the folder contained copies of incident reports that were never filed properly. Some pages looked like drafts, with missing signatures and handwritten notes in the margins. One note said, "Do not send to county. Handle internally until winter." Marlo took one look and asked for a formal chain of custody, and the sergeant agreed. She said the folder was supposed to be locked in the district safe, not in a wall. She also said the station had been used for unofficial debriefs after certain rescues. According to her, some calls were sensitive, and she regretted how that culture formed. That was when the twist started to take shape, not as a movie shock, but as a pattern. The missing rangers were not missing in the wilderness. They were missing from the schedule. Their names were not on the public roster that week, and the training sign was a lie. The station had been used as a private listening post where recordings could be reviewed. Tamsin asked why anyone would hide that, and Marlo gave a careful answer. She said there had been a whistleblower complaint months earlier, and people got scared. If the county took control of the station comms, certain mistakes would become permanent record. So someone tried to control the record, and controlling the record meant controlling the phones. The warning call to Tamsin now made a different kind of sense, and it was worse. Someone wanted the blue folder protected, but also wanted the patch setup discovered safely. They did not trust the sheriff, or they did not trust certain deputies, or both. So they called the one person who understood radios and who was not part of either side. Dispatch later confirmed something else from their archives, and it was the key detail. During the open line 911 calls, a faint voice was barely audible under the clicking. It sounded like a person trying to speak while someone else held a hand over their mouth. The words were not clear, but one phrase appeared in multiple transcript attempts. Not the safe. Not the safe. Marlowe heard that and went pale, because the district safe had been opened that morning. The safe was located at a different office, miles away, and only two people had access. One was Marlowe, and the other was a senior ranger who had called in sick. Marlowe said she never opened it, and she offered her keys to the sergeant without hesitation. A search warrant followed, and what investigators reportedly found was not dramatic, just damning. The safe held empty folders where the blue folder should have been. A log showed it was accessed the previous night, after hours, with a code entry recorded. The code was used correctly, which meant the person knew it or forced someone to type it. The senior ranger returned to work days later with a lawyer, and he said nothing useful. No charges were publicly announced connected to that specific day, at least not at the time. But internal discipline followed, and several staff were reassigned quietly over the next months. Marlowe kept her job, but she was moved to a role with less direct control. For Tamsin, the last piece came from her own recorder, which she finally got back. She listened to the first warning call again, and she noticed a soft second voice. It was so low that it sounded like air on the line, unless she wore good headphones. The second voice said one word, right after, "Bring the radio keys." It said, "Please." That was the part that bothered her most, because it sounded human and scared. It did not sound like a plot. It sounded like a person trapped in a bad decision. Tamsin gave the clip to the detective assigned to the case, and it went into evidence. After that, she was told not to discuss it, and she kept that promise. Years later, the station reopened with new locks, new policies, and a new phone system. The poster at dispatch stayed up because it did not blame anyone by name. It simply said, "Never ignore calls from a ranger station," because sometimes the call is not a request. Sometimes it is the only safe way someone can say that something is terribly wrong. The stories. The final voicemail from a highway turnout. The last thing on the missing man's phone was a voicemail he never sent. It came from a highway turnout that did not exist on any official map. In late October of 2016, Dax Merritt drove the same mountain corridor he had worked for years. He was 37, and he was a contracted line inspector for a regional telecom company. That Thursday started simple, and he wanted to clear 3 flagged signal sites before dark. The forecast was dry, the road was open, and his manager expected his report by 7. Dax left a small rental house outside a mid-sized western town and headed toward the pass. He carried a work tablet, a handheld spectrometer, and 2 spare battery packs. His company van had a dash camera, but it only saved clips when it detected hard braking. He had coffee in a steel mug and a new pair of work gloves on the passenger seat. By the time he hit the climb, he was already thinking about the last site and the warm diner off the main road. At 10:43, his phone connected to a tower near the ridgeline. The connection would matter later because it was the last clean handoff on record. Around 11, a weathered sign for a scenic turnout appeared, and the pull-off widened to gravel. Some locals called it the old switchback view, but the state never marked it as a formal stop. It was still used by hunters, tired drivers, and people who needed a quiet minute. A trucker would later tell a deputy he saw a white service van easing into that gravel. He said the driver looked like he was checking his mirrors, then stopped near the far edge. The trucker did not think much of it, because he saw that kind of thing often. He kept driving, and the van did not follow. At 12:15, Dax's manager texted about an unrelated ticket. Dax never replied. At 1:10, a coworker called, and it went to voicemail on the second ring. At 3, the manager called again and got voicemail again. By 5, the company's after-hours line had 2 missed check-ins, and a supervisor started calling State Patrol. A trooper found the van at 7:40 that night, still parked at the turnout. The keys were not in the ignition, but they were on the driver's floor mat. The work tablet was gone, and so was Dax's phone, but his mug was in the cup holder. There was no blood, no broken glass, and no obvious struggle in the gravel. The trooper photographed tire marks, then walked the edge where the turnout dropped into timber. He found nothing except a crushed cigarette butt and a small strip of black tape. Search crews came the next morning, and the timeline hardened into records and guesses. Dispatch logs showed the first call from the supervisor at 5:18. A local deputy arrived at the turnout at 8:02, then requested a drone unit. The drone footage showed steep trees, boulders, and a narrow seasonal creek. There was no clear trail, and no obvious sign of a fall. Dax's phone company produced tower data by the weekend, and it showed his phone had moved once after noon. The phone connected briefly, then dropped off the network for good. It looked like a device that lost power, or entered a dead pocket, or was turned off on purpose. Investigators noted the missing tablet too, because it carried maps and site notes. That made the case feel less like an accident and more like an intentional disappearance. On Monday, Dax's sister, Lenora Merritt, drove in from another state. She was 39, and she worked as an office manager for a clinic. She had a plain voice and a steady way of asking questions that people took seriously. She brought printed bank statements, a copy of his lease, and a folder of photos. She also brought something nobody else had yet. She had access to his voicemail account on an old family plan. Lenora said she checked it in her motel room because she needed to hear his voice. She expected routine work calls and maybe a message from a friend. Instead, she found one voicemail marked as saved with no sender listed. The timestamp showed 12:12 and the call length was 48 seconds. It was titled as if Dax had called his own mailbox, which can happen if a phone glitches during a call. Lenora played it for the deputy assigned to the family liaison role. The recording sounded like it came from inside a vehicle, with wind around a cracked window. Dax's voice was low and rushed, and it did not match the calm tone he used on work calls. He said, "If this is me later, don't laugh. Something's wrong up here. I'm at the turnout. That pull-off with the busted rail." He swallowed, then added, "There's a truck that shouldn't be here, and somebody's walking around like they're looking for me." He paused, then said, "If I hang up, it's because I can't talk, but I'm not leaving the van. I'm not leaving it." Then the voicemail ended with a click and a faint thud like a hand hitting plastic. There were no screams, no crash sounds, and no clear second voice. Still, the words were enough to change the case because they introduced intent. It made the turnout feel less like a place Dax chose for a break and more like a place he could not escape. The deputy forwarded the file to a detective, and they treated it as potentially authentic but uncertain. They requested the raw audio and asked the carrier for routing details. The carrier confirmed the call originated from Dax's own phone number, and it was dialed to his voicemail access line. That meant Dax could have hit speed dial, or a button, or a malfunction could have done it. Either way, the call likely came from his phone while it was on the network. The detective returned to the turnout with Lenora 2 days later. He asked her to point out what Dax might have meant by the busted rail. On the far side of the gravel, an old guardrail ended in a jagged break. A section had been removed years earlier, and the posts were cut close to the ground. A casual driver would not notice, but a person who had been there before might. Near those cut posts, the detective found 2 small bits of black tape stuck to the wood. It looked like electrical tape, the kind used to wrap cables in a hurry. A lab later found faint fibers, consistent with work gloves. That did not prove anything, but it aligned with Dax being near the edge while still trying to stay close to his van. The detective asked for local traffic camera footage, but the area had only one camera far down the pass. It showed Dax's van heading uphill at 10:27. It also showed a dark pickup passing the camera 3 minutes later. The pickup's plate was unreadable, and the driver could not be seen. Still, that pickup became a shadow in the case file because it matched what Dax said: "There's a truck that shouldn't be here." Investigators interviewed workers who had jobs near the pass. A road maintenance crew had been patching a shoulder that week, and their supervisor said they finished by 10. A private towing company had responded to a stranded camper earlier, but their truck was logged elsewhere at noon. A logger from a small outfit admitted he parked at the turnout sometimes, but he swore he was at lunch in town. Witness statements were thin, and everyone had a reason to be on those roads. Lenora focused on what she could control, which was Dax's habits and his gear. She asked the telecom company for his recent tickets, and she noticed one that seemed small but odd. It involved repeated interference at a site near the pass, blamed on an unknown device. Dax had written in his notes that the interference was patterned, not random. He wrote that it came and went like someone was testing a transmitter. That note pushed the detective toward a different theory. Dax worked around towers and lines, and he carried equipment that could identify illegal transmitters. Someone running a hidden setup would not want a telecom inspector asking questions. It was still speculative, but it fit the missing tablet. It also fit the strange tape by the rail, because tape like that is used by people who handle cables. The detective requested Dax's company van data, including GPS pings. The van had a basic fleet tracker that updated every 15 minutes, but only if it had signal. The tracker showed the van stopped at the turnout at 11:04. It stayed there until the trooper found it. There were no other pings, and no signs the van moved. The case stalled in the normal way, with searches that found nothing and tips that went nowhere. Then, in early November, a volunteer found a phone in the creek below the turnout. It was wedged between stones in a shallow bend, and it was coated with silt. The battery was gone, and the back panel was missing. The screen was cracked, but the serial number matched Dax's phone. The phone could not be powered on, but a forensics tech recovered fragments from the storage chip. Most of it was corrupted, yet they pulled a partial audio file that matched the voicemail. The recovered file was longer than the voicemail, by about 7 seconds. That mattered because it suggested the voicemail cut off before the recording actually ended. Something happened at the end that did not get stored in the mailbox. The tech enhanced the last seconds carefully and conservatively. They did not add new sounds, but they reduced hiss and boosted the mid-range. A faint second voice emerged, not close enough to be clear, but close enough to feel present. It was a male voice, and it said something like, "Hands where I can see." Then there was that same thud, heavier this time, like the phone hit the dash. The file ended with wind noise and a soft scraping sound. That was the first time the detective felt the case shift from uncertain to sharp. If the voice was real, Dax did not wander off or fall. Someone confronted him, and the voicemail became an accidental record of that moment. The detective asked the lab to write the report in careful language. It said a second voice was possibly present, consistent with a nearby speaker. It did not claim an exact phrase, because that would overreach. Lenora wanted action, and she started working her own angle through Dax's coworkers. She learned Dax had complained about a specific dead zone along the pass. He said his phone always dropped near the turnout, which was odd because the ridge should have line of sight. He also mentioned, casually, that he had found an unlisted utility box near the gravel. He joked that it looked like someone's secret project. That comment stuck with her, and she asked the detective to search for any utility permits. The state had no record of a box at that turnout. The detective returned with a technician from the highway department, and they walked the tree line. They found a low metal cabinet, half hidden behind brush, about 30 yards from the gravel. It was locked, with a fresh padlock and a thin cable running into the ground. The technician said it was not state equipment, and the detective photographed it from every angle. They called in a specialist and got a warrant to open it. Inside was a small power inverter, a battery bank, and a compact radio transmitter rig. It was wired to a directional antenna mounted higher in the trees, camouflaged with brown tape. The setup looked temporary, but it was active at some point recently. The detective connected that discovery to Dax's interference note. Someone had been operating an illegal transmitter near the pass, likely to disrupt signals or monitor traffic. It explained the dead zone, and it explained why Dax's phone might have struggled after noon. It also explained why someone might want Dax gone, because he was the kind of worker who noticed odd signal patterns. The next step was finding who serviced that cabinet, and that came from a mundane clue. The cabinet had a smear of red clay on the lower hinge, not local to that rocky slope. A highway worker recognized the color as soil from a gravel pit used by a small contractor about 40 miles away. The detective contacted the pit manager and learned one company rented that pit regularly. It was a two-truck outfit that did short-term hauling, and it owned a dark pickup with a ladder rack. The detective did not assume guilt, and he moved slowly with records. He obtained cell tower logs for phones that pinged near the turnout at noon and compared them to known workers. Many were pass-through travelers, and most were gone in minutes. One device, though, connected and disconnected repeatedly in a pattern that looked like testing. That device was tied to a prepaid account, but it showed up again near the gravel pit on other days. They watched the pit for a week, and the dark pickup appeared on a Tuesday morning. The driver was a man in his 40s with a patchy beard, and he loaded equipment cases into the bed. Investigators followed at a distance, and the truck headed toward the pass. It took a side road, then stopped near a different pull-off, not the turnout. A second man met him there, and they opened a case that looked like radio gear. The detective pulled them over after they drove back to the highway and asked routine questions. The men gave confusing answers about hunting and surveying, and they did not have permits. One of them had a pocket knife with black tape wrapped around the handle. The detective did not arrest them on the spot, because he still needed a clean link to Dax. He seized the gear under an equipment violation, then pushed for a deeper search. The twist, the one that landed hardest for Lenora, came from Dax's own work tablet. It turned up in a pawn shop 2 counties away, sold for cash by a middleman. The pawnbroker said the seller claimed it was from an estate cleanout. Security footage showed the middleman clearly, and he was a low-level thief known to local police. When questioned, he admitted he bought the tablet cheap from a man with a dark pickup. He described the seller as nervous and said the man kept looking over his shoulder. Forensics on the tablet found Dax's last open file, a note he wrote at 11:59. It said, "Turnout cabinet not marked, signal jammer likely, report to state, get plate if possible." That note was typed fast, with mistakes, then saved without his usual formatting. It read like someone writing while watching their mirrors. The detective paired that note with the voicemail, and it made sense in a grim way. Dax stopped at the turnout to verify interference. He found the unlisted cabinet, and he planned to report it. A truck arrived, and the people running the setup realized what he was doing. Dax tried to create a record, and his phone called his voicemail by accident or instinct. That voicemail became the last trace of him alive on any system. The case did not end clean, and it did not give Lenora the kind of closure she wanted. The men tied to the transmitter denied harming Dax, and they claimed it was for private testing. Evidence placed them near the turnout, and it tied them to the cabinet and to the tablet sale. It still did not place Dax's body in any one spot, and the mountains kept their silence. Prosecutors focused on the illegal transmitter, the theft, and obstruction, and they built what they could prove. Years later, Lenora kept a copy of that voicemail on a flash drive in her desk. She played it once a year, not to suffer, but to remember his thinking. He sounded scared, but he also sounded like himself, practical and stubborn. He said he would not leave the van, and that detail still haunted her. It meant he believed the safest place was right there, until someone changed the rules. The turnout is still there, and the gravel still crunches under tires on quiet afternoons. Most people stop for the view, then drive on without a second thought. The strange part is how ordinary the place looks. Even after everything that happened, it is just a patch of gravel and a broken rail, with trees that do not talk. And yet, for one short minute on a workday in 2016, it held a voicemail that was never meant to exist. The stories. The unsettling truth about this church basement. The first dispatch note called it a welfare check, but the basement door was bolted from the outside. By dawn, the church had taped off its own hallway, and nobody could agree on what they heard. In a river town in the upper Midwest, the old brick church sat 1 block from the courthouse. It was the kind of place that hosted potlucks, weddings, and quiet funerals all year. On a humid Tuesday in late summer, a man named Teague Ralston showed up early. Teague was 36, and he worked as a municipal building inspector for the county. He planned to finish one routine inspection, then grab coffee before his afternoon meetings. The church had applied for a permit to replace a stair rail near the basement steps. Teague had signed off on similar work dozens of times, and he expected nothing unusual. The pastor met him at the side entrance, smiling like this was an easy win. Her name was MrBallen, and she looked tired under her neat hair. She apologized for the smell of paint, then said the contractor was running late. Teague asked for the basement access, since that was where the steps started. Maris led him down a narrow hallway, past a bulletin board and a locked office door. At the end, a heavy metal door sat under a faded exit sign. Maris reached for her keyring, then stopped and frowned at the latch. The padlock was already on, and it was snapped shut. Maris said, "That's not ours. We don't lock it like that." Teague leaned close and saw a fresh scratch in the metal near the staple. It looked like someone had forced the lock into place with a tool. He asked who had a key, and Maris shook her head too quickly. Teague didn't like surprises, especially around fire egress and public spaces. He told Maris he needed the lock removed, and he would note it in his report. Maris tried to laugh, then said, "Maybe the contractor did it for safety." Teague asked for the contractor's name, and she gave a company he recognized. He called the number from his phone, and it went to a generic voicemail prompt. A muffled thump came from the other side of the door. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, like a knee hitting a wall. Maris went still, then whispered, "Did you hear that?" Teague put his ear near the seam, and he heard a faint dragging sound. It lasted only a second, then there was silence again. Teague stepped back and asked if anyone was down there. Maris said the basement was empty, and her voice sounded practiced. Teague tried the handle anyway, and it didn't budge. He told Maris he was calling it in because a locked basement wasn't normal. Maris lifted her hands, then said, "Please, don't make a scene." Teague called the non-emergency line for the police department. He kept his voice calm, and he described the lock and the noise. The dispatcher asked if he saw smoke or immediate danger, and he said no. Then the dispatcher asked if anyone was missing, and Teague hesitated. Maris answered that nobody was missing, but she sounded irritated. The dispatcher said an officer would come by when available. Teague didn't love that, so he tried the door again, harder this time. The metal rattled, and the padlock held. Another thump came from inside, followed by what sounded like a quick breath. Teague looked at Maris, and she stared at the floor tiles. He told her he was going to step outside and find a tool. Maris said, "You can't break church property." Teague said, "Someone might be trapped. I'm not waiting." He walked out to his truck, grabbed a small bolt cutter, and headed back inside. He carried it like it was just another piece of work gear. Maris followed him, and her shoes squeaked on the tile. She said the church had an old fallout shelter room down there. Nothing more. Teague asked why a fallout room would need a fresh padlock. Maris said, "It's complicated. We just need time." Teague didn't answer because his focus had narrowed to the lock. He knelt, set the cutter jaws, and squeezed. The lock resisted, then snapped with a sharp crack. The door swung inward an inch, as if pressure had been holding it closed. A breath of air spilled out, sour and damp, like wet cardboard and old bleach. Teague pulled the door open and stepped into the stairwell. The light switch didn't work, so he used his phone flashlight. The steps were steep, and the handrail was new, still sticky with paint. Halfway down, he saw scuff marks on the wall, like heels had kicked during a struggle. At the bottom, the basement opened into a wide room with folding tables stacked neatly. Teague called out again, and his voice echoed off concrete. A soft whimper answered from behind a partition wall near the furnace room. He moved slowly, keeping his light low, and he saw a figure crouched by a pipe. It was a young man, late teens maybe, with wrists red and raw. Duct tape lay on the floor beside him, torn and dirty. The young man flinched when the light hit his face. He raised his hands and said, "Don't close it. Please don't close it." Teague said, "It's open. You're okay. What's your name?" The young man swallowed and said, "Kellen. Kellen Drex." His voice was hoarse, like he had been shouting for hours. Teague asked if anyone else was down there. Kellen shook his head, then pointed toward a storage closet. He said, "They moved the stuff," they said, "to keep quiet." Teague asked who, and Kellen's eyes darted upward toward the stairs. He said, "Church people." Not all, just some. Teague told him he was calling police again, and he did it immediately. This time, he said there was a restrained person in the basement. The dispatcher's tone changed, and she said officers were on the way. Teague stayed between Kellen and the stairs, watching the doorway like it might bite. Maris appeared at the top step, framed by the hallway light. She looked down and froze when she saw Kellen. Her face went pale, then her jaw tightened like she was forcing herself to breathe. She started down one step, then stopped, gripping the rail. Teague said, "Don't come closer, just wait upstairs." Maris said, "Kellen, what are you doing here?" Kellen didn't answer, and his shoulders shook with contained sobs. Teague watched Maris's hands, because they were trembling. She said, "This isn't what it looks like." Teague said, "It looks like someone locked him in." Maris backed up without another word. Teague heard her shoes retreat, then a door slam somewhere above. For a moment, the basement felt even colder, despite the humid air. Kellen whispered, "She's not the worst one." Teague asked who was, and Kellen stared at the concrete. 2 officers arrived within minutes, according to later timestamps in the logs. They came down cautiously, hands near their belts, lights sweeping the corners. Teague explained what happened, and Kellen repeated his name and age. He said he was 19, and he had come to talk to someone at the church. He claimed he had been in a counseling session, then told to wait downstairs. Kellen said he asked to leave, and someone blocked the stairs. He said there were voices, then tape, then the click of a lock. He couldn't name everyone, but he described one man with a heavy ring. He remembered the ring because it scratched his cheek when tape was pressed down. He also remembered a sweet chemical smell, like a cleaner or solvent. The officers took Kellen upstairs and sat him on a chair in the fellowship hall. They asked Teague to stay. Since he was a witness and the one who cut the lock, Teague sat at a table with a paper cup of water, hands still buzzing. A third officer walked through the building, checking rooms and doors. The basement door was now open, and a strip of tape marked it as a scene. Maris finally returned, with another person close behind her. It was a man in a suit jacket, older, broad-shouldered, and polished-looking. He introduced himself as the church administrator, Hollis Quaid. He asked why police were in his building, and his tone was offended. One officer said there was a report of unlawful restraint, and Hollis smiled tightly. Hollis said, "This is a misunderstanding. The young man is unstable." Kellen looked up at that, and his mouth opened in disbelief. He said, "I asked to leave? You told them to lock it." Hollis raised a hand and said, "Son, you were a danger to yourself." Kellen shook his head, and tears rolled down his cheeks. Teague watched Hollis, and he noticed something small. On Hollis's right hand, a thick ring glinted under the hall lights. It was silver, with a dark stone that looked almost black. Teague remembered Kellen's detail, and his stomach tightened again. He told the officer quietly about the ring description and the scratch detail. The officers asked Hollis to step aside, and they requested keys and records. Hollis said the church kept counseling notes confidential, protected by policy. The officer said policy wasn't the same as law, and he asked again. Maris stood behind Hollis, eyes on the floor, hands clasped so hard her knuckles whitened. The air in the room felt thin, like everyone was holding their breath at once. Kellen asked for his phone, and he said it was taken from him. He said his backpack was in the basement storage closet. An officer went down with Teague and retrieved it, carefully, like evidence. Inside the backpack was a notebook with scribbled dates and names. There was also a small digital voice recorder, the kind used for lectures. Kellen said he carried it because he forgot things when he got anxious. He said he recorded meetings sometimes so he could replay them later. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them asked if he recorded today. Kellen nodded and said, "I think it's still running." Teague felt a cold flush, because that meant everything might be on tape. The recorder was still on, and its red light blinked weakly. The officer stopped it, bagged it, and noted the time. They didn't play it there, but later reports referenced a partial audio file. It reportedly captured voices arguing about liability, reputation, and keeping things contained. It also reportedly captured a sentence about the lock, spoken like an instruction. Teague didn't hear the audio himself, not that day. What he saw was the way Hollis's confidence cracked when the recorder appeared. His smile faded, and his eyes went sharp, like a cornered animal. He asked who was allowed to record, and an officer told him to stay quiet. Maris's face looked like it might fold in half, and she pressed a palm to her mouth. Kellen also had photos on his phone, which officers later recovered from the basement. He had snapped pictures of a hallway bulletin board before the session started. The photos showed a calendar with handwritten blocks and initials beside time slots. There were also sticky notes with room numbers, and one said basement. Another said lock check, with a date written for that morning. Teague asked how Kellen took photos if his phone was taken. Kellen said he took them earlier when nobody was watching, then hid the phone briefly. He said someone found it later, after he asked to leave. That detail sounded messy, but it also sounded like the truth. The photos had timestamps that fit the sequence, according to the officer's comment. By late afternoon, investigators from the county arrived. They took statements, photographed the lock, and measured the scuff marks on the wall. They also photographed the new handrail and the paint that smeared near the scratches. A technician swabbed the tape scraps for residue and fingerprints. Teague watched from the side, trying to make his breathing slow and steady. Kellen was taken to a clinic for evaluation, mostly for dehydration and stress. A nurse later noted bruising consistent with restraint, according to a summary Teague heard. The clinic also documented abrasions on his wrists and cheek. None of it proved motive, but it supported Kellen's story. Teague sat in his truck afterward, hands on the wheel, not turning the key. He went back to his office and filed his inspection report anyway. He noted the padlocked egress door, the broken lock, and the potential hazard. He attached photos he took after police arrived, keeping them factual and clean. He also wrote a separate memo for his supervisor, because this felt bigger. His supervisor told him to forward everything to the county attorney's office. Over the next week, rumors spread through town faster than any official update. People argued at diners, in parking lots, and on church steps after Sunday service. Some said Kellen was trespassing. Others said the church was hiding something. Teague tried to keep his head down, but he kept getting calls. A local reporter left voicemails asking for comment, and he never answered. Then, a new detail surfaced, and it shifted the whole story. A retired maintenance worker came forward after seeing the news segment. He said the basement door had been altered years earlier. He said the church once had a crash bar on the inside, but it was removed. He said he complained, and he was told it was temporary during renovations. The maintenance worker provided an old photo taken during a volunteer workday. It showed the same door, but with the crash bar still installed. In the background, a whiteboard listed tasks, and one line said, "Remove bar." The date on the whiteboard was written in thick marker, 2012. Teague stared at the photo in disbelief, because it matched what he saw now. That meant the basement exit had been made easier to trap from the outside. Teague realized the padlock was not an accident or a one-time panic. It looked more like a system, slowly built to be invisible. A door that should always open had been turned into a cage. The unsettling truth wasn't only what happened to Kellen, it was how ready the building was. Investigators requested records related to renovations and safety inspections. They also subpoenaed emails from the church's administrative accounts. According to later summaries, certain messages referenced discretion and risk management. There were also references to a room used for difficult conversations. Nobody wrote the word basement as a confession, but the hints lined up. Teague was asked to come in for a follow-up interview. He described the lock, the noises, Maris's reaction, and Hollis's ring. He also mentioned the smell of cleaner, since Kellen remembered it too. An investigator told him they found a jug of industrial solvent downstairs. It was used for stripping floors, but it also made tape stick better for a while. Weeks later, the county released a statement that charges were being considered. They didn't name suspects in public, but they confirmed a continuing inquiry. The church suspended counseling sessions and closed the basement to the public. Hollis resigned, citing health reasons, and Maris took a leave of absence. None of that felt like closure. It felt like a curtain drawn quickly. Teague kept thinking about the moment the lock snapped. He had expected an empty room and a minor code violation. Instead, he found a person waiting in the dark, trying not to panic. He wondered how many others had sat down there and stayed quiet. He wondered how many people believed it was for their own good. Kellen eventually moved away, according to a neighbor who spoke to Teague later. He didn't want to be known as the basement kid for the rest of his life. Teague respected that. and he never tried to contact him again. He kept his role small, just a witness who did his job. Still, the sound of that thump behind the door stayed with him. On certain mornings, Teague drove past the church on his way to inspections. The building looked the same from the street, steady and respectable. Sunlight hit the stained glass, and cars lined the curb for community events. But Teague knew what could be hidden behind a quiet hallway. He learned that safety wasn't only codes and rails, it was who held the keys. The stories. This tape explains the warning signs. The tape was logged into evidence on a Tuesday, and the label only said, "Warning signs, do not ignore." When people finally listened to it, a year of roadside deaths stopped looking random and started looking engineered. In late 2019, Dax Calder was 37 and worked as a county sign technician for Public Works. He spent most days replacing faded reflectors, straightening bent posts, and arguing with weathered bolts. That morning, he had one simple goal: confirm the new warning signs on a mountain bypass were correct. The bypass cut through pine forest and rocky slopes about 20 miles from a small river town. It was the kind of road locals used to avoid traffic, and tourists used when their GPS got stubborn. For months, there had been crash reports near mile marker 12, mostly at night and in clear weather. Dispatch logs described drivers swearing they followed the signs, right up until the road turned wrong. Dax parked his county truck by a gravel pull-off, then walked the shoulder with a clipboard. He counted chevrons, measured sign height, and checked that each post was seated firmly in packed dirt. Everything looked normal at first, and that bothered him more than anything strange ever could. If the road was dangerous, it should look dangerous, and it did not. The first warning sign was a standard yellow curve sign with an advisory speed. It was fresh, reflective, and aimed straight at the lane like it had been installed yesterday. Dax wrote down its placement, then stood behind it to check the bolts in the bracket. That was when he saw the backplate had a second set of holes, drilled clean and recent. He touched the metal and felt a faint grit, like someone had ground it and wiped it fast. County signs came from a warehouse, and nobody was supposed to drill new holes in the field. Dax took photos anyway, then noted the serial number stamped near the lower edge. The serial number did not match the shipment list he printed that morning. He drove farther and found the next sign, a narrow bridge warning near a shallow ravine. The bridge was not narrow, and the guardrails were modern and well-maintained. Dax checked his map and confirmed there was no bridge project scheduled for this road. He stared at the sign until his eyes started hunting for an explanation that was not there. A pickup came up behind him, slow and cautious, then stopped in the lane with hazards flashing. The driver rolled down the window and asked if the road was closed because the signs looked wrong. Dax said the road was open, and he asked what signs the driver had seen. The driver said, 2 detour arrows and a warning about a drop-off, and none of it made sense. Dax felt a tight heat in his chest because his clipboard showed no detour signs at all. He asked where the driver saw them, and the driver pointed back toward a turn he had already passed. Dax thanked him, then watched the pickup crawl away like the driver did not trust the pavement. When the truck disappeared, Dax walked to his county rig and called his supervisor. His supervisor was Renly Goss, early 50s, a practical manager who hated surprises. Renly answered on the second ring and sounded annoyed until Dax said, "Wrong signs," and "new drill holes." Renly told him to pull the signs if he could, and to document everything before touching anything. Dax agreed, then drove back toward the turn the pickup driver mentioned. The detour arrows were there, but they were not county issue, and they were not on proper posts. They were strapped to trees with metal banding, angled to pull drivers toward a dirt service road. The service road dropped downhill into dense brush, then curved behind a ridge and disappeared. A small hand-painted board read "Bridge Out," and the letters looked fresh. Dax stood at the edge and watched a sedan approach, headlights bright in late afternoon shade. The driver slowed, saw the detour, and started to turn onto the service road without hesitation. Dax stepped into view and waved both arms, forcing the driver to stop hard. The driver rolled down the window and said, "The signs told me to go this way." Dax told the driver to stay on the paved bypass because the detour was not official. The driver looked embarrassed, then angry, and asked why the signs were there at all. Dax did not have an answer he could prove, so he said they were unauthorized and dangerous. The driver backed out carefully and left, and Dax felt his hands trembling afterward. He took photos of every arrow, every strap, and every bolt head. He also noticed something else. Each detour sign was placed just before a blind curve. Drivers had only a second to decide, and the detour looked like the safe choice. Dax recorded voice notes on his phone, then tried to send them, and the upload stalled. The bypass had patchy coverage, so he saved everything and drove to higher ground. From a ridge turnout, he finally got enough signal to send Renly a batch of photos. Renly called back immediately and told him to stop touching anything and wait for law enforcement. Dax said he would, but he did not like leaving the signs up even for an hour. A deputy arrived 40 minutes later, a lean woman named Tressa Mullaney, mid-30s. She listened, took her own photos, and called it in with a tone that turned serious fast. Tressa asked if Dax had seen anyone nearby, and Dax said only one pickup passing earlier. She nodded and said that matched witness statements from past crash calls. They removed the tree-strapped signs and loaded them into the deputy SUV. Under the painted board, they found a strip of reflective tape like a road crew used. Tressa said the county did not use that exact tape, and she sounded certain about it. Dax asked if this was connected to the crashes, and she said, "It looks like it could be." Renly told Dax to return to the yard and pull old installation records for the bypass. Dax spent the evening in a dusty office, flipping binders and scanning sign serial numbers. He found that 2 shipments had gone missing over the past year, both marked as minor losses. The lost notes said damaged in transit, which now felt like a lazy answer. The next day, Tressa met Dax in a small interview room at the sheriff office. She played him a clip from an archived 911 call from 2018. A shaken driver described a bridge-out sign and a detour that led into darkness. The driver said he turned back in time, and he kept repeating that the signs looked official. Tressa also had crash scene photos from 2018 and 2019. In each case, responders found tire tracks on the same service road leading to the ravine. Some vehicles rolled, some hit trees, and one went far enough that it was hard to locate. The official reports blamed driver error because no one could confirm the signs. Dax stared at the photos and realized why the signs were never in evidence. The signs did not stay up long, and nobody thought to collect them until too late. Tressa said a volunteer firefighter once mentioned hearing a power tool at night. The firefighter never reported it because the sound faded and nothing seemed wrong then. Now that detail mattered, and the deputy wrote it down with a grim look. Dax tried to think like a technician, not like a person getting spooked. He made a map of where the fake signs had been placed, using his photos and GPS stamps. A pattern showed up fast. Each cluster was near a spot where a vehicle could not easily turn around. If a driver committed to the detour, they were trapped by narrow cuts and loose gravel. Tressa asked if county staff could have installed them, even by accident. Dax said county crews would not strap signs to trees with banding because it broke policy. He also said the drilled sign backs meant someone had access to real county panels. That did not prove anything alone, but it narrowed the pool of people who could do it. Renly gave Dax a copy of the warehouse key log because he trusted Dax more than paperwork. The log was half digital and half scribbled, and it looked sloppier than it should have. Dax compared times to the missing shipments and saw repeated entries by the same initials. Those initials belonged to a contract yard worker who only handled loading and trash. The worker was named Cale Rydell, early 40s, hired through a staffing agency. Cale had access to the sign racks at night because he swept the yard and locked gates. That alone was not enough. But the timeline kept lining up in ways that felt too clean. Tressa asked for Cale's address, and Renly refused, saying it needed proper process. That is when the tape entered the story, quietly and almost by accident. A retired dispatcher called the sheriff office and said she had saved an odd recording. She said it was not a 911 call, it was a voicemail left on a county line. The voicemail was from a man who sounded calm, describing a warning system with pride. The cassette-style tape was old because the dispatcher kept personal backups in the 90s. She had transferred it to a digital file years later, but still called it a tape out of habit. Tressa brought the audio to Dax because the voice mentioned signs, bolts, and the bypass. Dax listened with headphones and felt his stomach drop within the first minute. The man on the recording said, "Those warnings are the whole thing. They guide them where you want." He talked about reflective angles and placement, like someone explaining a craft. He mentioned using real county panels, because drivers trusted official metal more than wood boards. He said the best trap was one that looked like safety, and he laughed softly after that. Tressa paused the audio and asked if Dax recognized the voice. Dax did not want to guess, but he said it sounded like someone he had heard on yard radios. Renly sometimes used a gravelly voice when he joked, but this was not Renly. Dax asked where the tape came from, and Tressa said it was dated 1998. That date made no sense at first because the bypass was not completed until 2003. Then Dax remembered something. The service road was older, and it used to serve a quarry site. Old county plans showed the area marked as restricted during blasting operations. Back then, there were warning signs, and the public learned to obey them without question. Tressa and Dax went to the county archive room, a basement space that smelled like damp cardboard. They pulled microfilm and dusty maps, and they found a file labeled Quarry Access Control. Inside were notes about repeated trespass incidents and stolen equipment. A line item mentioned Deterrent Signage Program, approved for night visibility. The author name was not Renly. It was a previous supervisor who retired long ago. That supervisor had a son who worked briefly at the county yard, then left under a cloud. Dax found the son's name in an old staffing roster, and it matched Cale Rydell's legal name. Cale had changed his last name later, and the archive file still carried the older one. Tressa ran it up the chain and got a warrant for Cale's phone and storage unit. The unit was across town, behind a row of auto shops, and it looked ordinary from outside. Inside, deputies found stacks of sign blanks, reflective sheeting, and a crate of banding straps. They also found a portable drill press and a set of county serial stamps. Cale did not deny making signs, but he claimed he was building props for a film project. Tressa asked why the props matched the crash locations and why they used county serial formats. Cale shrugged and said people drove too fast, and they would crash anywhere. Then he said something that matched the tape, almost word for word. He said, "If they see a warning, they do what the warning says." That line hit the room like a cold slap because it was not a defense. It was a philosophy, and it sounded practiced, like he had repeated it for years. The payoff came when they compared the tape voice to a recorded jail call. The sheriff office had legal access to that call, and a voice analyst reported a strong match. It was not perfect science, but combined with the tools and the signs, it added weight. Tressa also found that Cale's father had been the quarry security contractor in 1998. That meant the tape was likely the father teaching the son, or the son learning early. Either way, it explained how the method existed before the bypass ever did. When the quarry shut down, the service road stayed, and the idea stayed with it. Then the bypass opened, and the trap finally had traffic. The case did not solve every crash with absolute certainty, and nobody promised it would. Some drivers were drunk, some were tired, and some made bad choices with no help from signs. Still, witness statements changed after the arrest because people finally trusted their own memory. Several said they saw a man at night moving calmly with a flashlight near the trees. The county replaced every warning sign on that stretch, using locked hardware and tracked serial scans. They also blocked the service road with boulders and steel posts, leaving only a narrow footpath. Dispatch logs showed a sharp drop in late-night crashes within weeks. The bypass became boring again, which was the best possible outcome. Dax kept a copy of the tape transcript in his work folder, even after the trial ended. He did not listen to it anymore, because the laughter at the end stuck in his head. He only remembered the lesson. Signs were supposed to protect people, not steer them into danger. When he bolted a warning sign to a post, he checked it twice, then checked it again. The stories. Why this small bridge kept people silent. The county kept records, yet this small bridge kept people silent for years after the last official report. When strangers asked about it, locals changed the subject fast, then acted like the question never happened. In late autumn of 2011, Marlo Kincaid drove out before sunrise with a thermos and a clipboard. Marlo was 36 and worked as a road maintenance inspector for the county transportation office. That morning, the job was simple. Check a minor bridge on a rural access road. A logging company wanted heavier trucks cleared for the season, and paperwork needed a clean inspection. The bridge sat in a shallow valley between scrub pines and old pasture, barely wide enough for two cars. It was the kind of span nobody photographed: stained concrete, low rails, and water trickling under stones. County maps called it a numbered structure, but locals called it Hush Bridge, like it was a joke. Marlowe had heard the nickname once in the office, and nobody explained it beyond a shrug. He parked on the shoulder and walked the length, boots scraping grit and dried leaves. The air smelled like wet bark, and the creek made a soft, steady sound under the deck. Marlowe took photos of hairline cracks and measured the rail height, then checked for fresh impact marks. Everything looked ordinary until he noticed the chalky streaks on the concrete near the center. The streaks were pale, like someone dragged a bag of powder across the deck and tried to rinse it. Marlowe crouched and ran a glove over it, then looked at his fingertips in the dim light. It was gritty, not mud, and it did not match road dust from the gravel shoulders. A faint chemical smell hung there, sharp enough that Marlowe stood up and breathed through his mouth. He stepped to the rail and looked down at the creek, expecting to see a dumped bag or broken container. The water was clear, and the stones looked clean, except for a dark patch beneath the bridge shadow. It was not oil, and it did not spread like fuel, yet it clung to the rocks. Marlowe snapped more photos, then wrote a note to call environmental services after he finished the inspection. A pickup rolled up behind him and idled. Then a man leaned out with both hands on the wheel. The man was older, heavy jacket, cap pulled low, and his face stayed half hidden. "You should do your paperwork quick," the man said, voice flat and careful. Marlowe nodded and gave the friendly answer he used with everyone on rural calls. "Just doing my job," Marlowe said, then tried to smile like the day was normal. The man did not smile back, and his eyes kept flicking to the center of the bridge. "People don't like talking here," the man said, then cleared his throat like he regretted speaking. Marlowe waited for more, but the man tapped the wheel once and stared straight ahead. After a long moment, the pickup backed up and turned around, tires crunching, then disappeared up the road. Marlowe finished the last measurements and walked back to his car, feeling watched from the trees. He called his supervisor, then mentioned the odd residue and the dark patch in the creek. The supervisor sounded tired and told him to file it, then send the photos to the shared drive. Marlowe also called the environmental hotline, and the dispatcher took notes without much reaction. On the drive back, Marlowe stopped at a small diner near the highway to grab a second coffee. The place was quiet, with two locals at the counter and a radio playing low behind the kitchen door. Marlowe asked the server, casual as he could, why folks called that bridge Hush Bridge. The server froze for half a second, then poured coffee like the question was about the weather. "Just an old nickname," she said, then looked away and added, "Better not chase it." Marlowe did not push, but the two locals heard, and the air changed in a way he could feel. One man stared at his plate, and the other cleared his throat and stood up too fast. Nobody said another word until Marlowe paid and left, and even then the bell over the door sounded loud. By the time he reached the parking lot, the feeling of being watched was back, only now in plain daylight. That evening, Marlowe uploaded the photos and wrote a clean report, yet he kept thinking about the powder. He zoomed in on the images at home, and the streaks looked like footprints that had been smeared. There were marks near the rail, then a long drag line toward the center of the deck. Marlowe told himself it was nothing, maybe spilled lime from a farm trailer, yet the smell bothered him. 2 days later, a county email came through saying the environmental call was closed as non-actionable. No site visit was scheduled, and the message included a short note, "No hazard observed from roadway." Marlowe read it twice and felt his jaw tighten because he had been on the roadway. He forwarded the email to his supervisor with a short question and got no reply. The next week, Marlowe went back on his own time, telling himself he needed better photos. He took a personal camera and a small flashlight, and arrived in late afternoon when shadows stretched long. The bridge looked the same, but the chalky streaks were gone, as if someone scrubbed them hard. Under the rail, a new bolt gleamed bright, and the rail itself had fresh scratches. Marlowe leaned over and saw the dark patch in the creek was gone too, replaced by clean stone. He followed the bank a short distance, then found a section where grass was flattened in a wide strip. There were tire prints that did not match county vehicles, and they angled down toward the water. Marlowe took photos, then walked back to the bridge with his stomach tight and his mouth dry. At the center of the deck, he noticed a thin line across the concrete, almost invisible in the fading light. It looked like a cut line from a saw, shallow but straight, running from rail to rail. Marlowe knelt and traced it with a fingertip, then pulled back when he felt a sharp edge. Someone had scored the deck surface, then patched it with a filler that almost matched the original. He heard a vehicle approach and stood quickly, stuffing his camera into his jacket. A county-marked SUV rolled up, and a uniformed deputy stepped out, hand resting near his belt. The deputy was a woman in her 40s, and her face carried that calm look of practiced control. "Evening," she said, then nodded toward the bridge like it belonged to her. "County business?" she asked, voice polite, but the question landed like a warning. Marlowe told the truth, sort of, and said he was following up on an earlier inspection. The deputy looked at him for a long beat, then walked to the rail and looked down. When she spoke again, her voice dropped lower, and she did not face him. "Folks around here don't need outsiders stirring things up," she said, still calm. Marlowe swallowed and tried to keep his tone steady, because his badge card was in his wallet. "I'm not stirring anything," Marlowe said. "I just need the bridge to be safe." The deputy turned back and studied him, then took out a small notepad and wrote something. "Keep your report in the system," she said, "and don't come back alone." Marlowe asked if there had been incidents here, and the deputy's eyes tightened for a second. "No official incidents," she said, then added, "Official is a careful word." She got back in the SUV and drove off slow, leaving Marlowe with the creak noise and his own breathing. That night, Marlowe searched the county archive portal from his laptop, using keywords and old structure numbers. He found a maintenance entry from 1998 that mentioned minor deck repair after an impact. The note was short and bland, yet it included a line about temporary closure for investigation support. Investigation support was not a road term, and it stuck out like a wrong part in an engine. Marlowe clicked for the attached report, but the attachment was missing, listed as migrated with errors. He tried another angle and searched local newspaper scans, which the library kept on a clunky site. A small article from 2003 mentioned a missing person case that ended with no charges filed. The article referenced a creek crossing on a rural access road, but did not name it. It included a quote from a sheriff spokesperson asking the public not to speculate. Marlowe noticed the public comment section was blank, as if it had been wiped or never allowed. The next day, Marlowe drove to the county records room during lunch, acting like he needed old bridge plans. The clerk on duty was a man named Sutter, round glasses, neat hair, and a careful, polite smile. Marlowe asked for the 1998 file tied to the structure number and watched Sutter's hands pause. Sutter typed slowly, then frowned at the screen like it offended him, and leaned closer to read. "That file isn't in public retrieval," Sutter said, then cleared his throat and looked away. Marlowe asked why, and Sutter lowered his voice until it was almost a whisper. "Some things got sealed after a meeting," Sutter said, "and nobody wants their name in it." Marlowe walked out feeling hot in the face, as if he had done something wrong by asking. He sat in his car and listened to the engine idle, then opened his phone and reviewed his bridge photos. The drag marks near the rail, the scored line, the fresh bolt, it all felt connected now. He decided to call someone who might speak without the county walls around them. A retired tow operator named Vance Aller lived on the edge of town and still fixed small engines for cash. Marlowe had met him once during a winter closure and remembered that Vance talked straight. Marlowe drove out after work and found Vance in a shed, hands black with grease and eyes sharp. Vance listened without interrupting, then sat back on a stool and rubbed his jaw. "That bridge eats noise," Vance said, then looked toward the open door like someone might be listening. Marlowe asked what that meant, and Vance exhaled slow through his nose. "Years ago," Vance said, "people used the bridge as a shortcut for hauling, and sometimes for things they did not log. There were nights when a car would idle on the span, lights off, then a splash would follow. Nobody saw a body, and nobody found one. Yet the creek carried scraps and odd stains after storms. Dispatch logs reportedly showed calls about screams, then callers hanging up when asked for their name. Vance said deputies drove out, walked the deck, then told everyone it was kids messing around. Marlowe asked why people stayed quiet, and Vance's face went still, like a door closing. Because the ones who asked too much got visits. Vance said, voice low and plain. He said a local businessman had friends in the right rooms, and he did favors for the county. When the bridge needed repairs, his company offered materials cheap, and everyone said thank you. Marlowe asked for a name, and Vance shook his head once, firm and final. Don't do that, Vance said. Names make it real, and real gets you hurt. Marlowe went home and sat at his kitchen table, staring at his notes until the paper blurred. He did not believe in ghost stories, and this did not feel like one anyway. It felt like people with power had used a forgotten spot to solve problems quietly. He decided to focus on what he could prove and to avoid guessing about who. On a Saturday morning, Marlowe returned to the bridge with a coworker, a younger inspector named Lita Rohn. Lita was 29, sharp and fearless in a way that made older men nervous. Marlowe told her only that something about the deck patch looked unsafe, and he needed a second set of eyes. They parked on opposite shoulders to avoid blocking the road, then walked the span together in silence. Lita knelt at the scored line and tapped the concrete with a small hammer, listening to the tone. Most of the deck rang solid, but near the line, the sound turned hollow, like a thin lid over air. She frowned and tapped again, then stood and looked at Marlowe with a hard, practical expression. This is a patch over a cutout, she said, keeping her voice level. If a truck hits this wrong, it could pop, she said, then pointed to the rail scratches. Something heavy got hauled over here, and it wasn't standard work. They photographed everything and marked the spot with a small removable tag, then left without lingering. That afternoon, Marlowe filed a safety escalation, using Lita's measurements and the hollow tone notes. The county system accepted the report, but within hours, the status changed to under review, then locked. Marlowe tried to open it again and got an error message about permissions. Lita called him, voice tight, and said her supervisor told her to stop talking about that bridge. Marlowe felt anger flare, then settle into something colder and more focused. He printed his photos and notes at home, then made a second copy on a small drive. He also wrote a timeline, keeping it clean, dates, what he saw, who he spoke to. He avoided names and stuck to actions, because actions were harder to argue with. Then he drove to the library and asked for the old dispatch logs in the local history room. The librarian on duty was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a gentle voice named Corbin Meza. Corbin listened and did not flinch, but he did glance toward the front desk now and then. He said some dispatch logs were public after a waiting period, unless flagged for legal reasons. Corbin pulled a box of microfilm and showed Marlowe how to use the reader without drawing attention. Marlowe scrolled through dates from 2003, then 2005, looking for creek crossing calls. He found a pattern that made his throat go tight, calls logged near midnight on weekends, always short. One entry mentioned shouting and a splash, and another mentioned a vehicle idling on the bridge with lights off. Several had the same note, caller refused to identify. Then call terminated. A few had a follow-up. Unit responded, no findings, area secure. Marlowe printed the entries and thanked Corbin, who only nodded and said, be careful with paper. On the way out, Marlowe noticed a woman standing near the magazine rack watching him too closely. She held a phone at chest height, screen angled like she was reading, yet her eyes tracked his hands. Marlowe kept walking and did not look back, but his skin prickled all the way to the parking lot. At home, he checked his truck for a tag or device and found nothing, yet the feeling stayed. That night, he got a call from an unknown number, and nobody spoke when he answered. The next week, a work order appeared in the county system for the bridge, scheduled for immediate resurfacing. Marlowe had not been asked for input, and the contractor listed was a private firm from 2 counties over. He drove out after hours and saw fresh cones and a portable light tower parked near the shoulder. 2 men in reflective jackets stood by a truck, but their uniforms were blank, no company name. Marlowe stayed in his car and watched from a distance, heart beating hard against his ribs. One of the men walked the deck and scraped at the scored line with a tool, then nodded. Another opened the back of the truck and pulled out something long wrapped in plastic, about the length of a person. They slid it across the deck toward the center, then disappeared under the bridge through the bank brush. Marlowe raised his phone and recorded through the windshield, keeping the screen dim. The video was shaky, yet it caught the moment the plastic dragged across the concrete and left a pale streak. Marlowe drove away before anyone looked up, and his hands shook on the steering wheel. At home, he watched the video frame by frame and saw the streak match his first photos. He could not tell what was inside the plastic, but the shape was wrong for tools or lumber. He also noticed something else. A third vehicle in the background, lights off, parked farther up the road. It was a county-marked SUV, and it sat there like a quiet promise. Marlowe did not take the video to his supervisor because that path was already closed. He took it to the state-level transportation safety office using a general intake line and a mailed packet. He included only the structural concern, the hollow tone test, the evidence of unauthorized deck alteration. He also included the dispatch log prints and wrote that local access appeared compromised. He did not accuse anyone, and he did not write theories, yet he knew what the packet implied. 2 months later, a state inspection team arrived without much notice, and the bridge was closed for a full day. They drilled test cores and scanned the deck with ground-penetrating equipment, then marked several spots in paint. A week after that, the county announced the bridge would be replaced due to unexpected internal deterioration. No mention was made of patches or cut lines, and no mention was made of why the deck had been altered. Locals accepted the announcement with the same quiet faces Marlowe had seen in the diner. During demolition in early spring of 2012, a worker reportedly found a sealed cavity inside the deck. The official statement said it contained debris and old construction waste, nothing hazardous to the public. Yet a separate rumor traveled faster than official statements ever did, and it never appeared in print. The rumor said the cavity held items that were bagged and removed under supervision before sunrise. Marlowe heard that from Vance, who said a friend on the crew stopped answering calls afterward. When the new bridge opened, it looked cleaner and safer. Higher rails, better drainage, fresh concrete. The nickname did not die, though, because nicknames survive facts and outlast signage. People still called it Hush Bridge, and they still got quiet when anyone asked why. Marlowe noticed something else. The creek bed under the new span was lined with rock like a neat blanket. It was the kind of work done to prevent erosion, or to bury what the water once revealed. Marlowe stayed with the county, and he never spoke publicly about his packet or his video. He did get one strange thing, a letter with no return address, postmarked from a city far away. Inside was a single photocopy of his 1998 archive search screen with one line highlighted. The line read, "Investigation support," and someone had written 2 words in pen beneath it. "Stop digging," it said, letters uneven like a hand that shook. He kept the letter anyway, folded in a plain envelope inside a locked drawer. Sometimes, on long drives for routine inspections, Marlowe took the older access road without thinking. He would slow near the new bridge and feel his throat tighten. Then he would keep going. Nothing jumped out, and no one chased him, because real life rarely gives clean endings. What stayed was the quiet, the practiced silence of people protecting themselves by saying nothing. Years later, Marlowe told Lita what he had found, but only after she moved out of the county. She listened, then said she always wondered why her report got locked so fast. Marlowe did not answer with a speech, because speeches do not fit a place like that. He only said the bridge was rebuilt, and the creek ran clear again, and still nobody talked. Some places do not need signs to warn people, because everyone already learned the rules.